located all the way in the south of Southeast Asia, is a country that few have heard of, let alone know much about. East Timor, or Timor-Leste, or the Democratic Republic of Timor-Leste, is a sovereign state that makes up the eastern portion of the island of Timor, with the western side belonging to Indonesia. However, it hasn't always been this way, and East Timor only gained full independence in 2002. So let's take a brief look at the country's history. We go all the way back 42,000 years ago, when humans first settled in East Timor, coming from the general Southeast Asia region. Then, around 37,000 years later, another wave of migration hit East Timor from the Melanesia region. Then came a third wave of migration from the South China and North Indochina region. So in the end, the inhabitants of East Timor were a diverse mix from the Eastern Hemisphere. But then, colonialism. The first Europeans to arrive on the island of Timor were the Portuguese in the early 1500s, and they established control over the land. In 1613, the Dutch turned up, arriving in Kupang on the western half of the island. The Dutch and the Portuguese both wanted control over the island, and they fought over the territory until the 1859 Treaty of Lisbon officially granted the Portuguese the eastern half of the island, duly named Portuguese Timor, and the Dutch the western half of the island, named, you guessed it, Dutch Timor. However, the two nations still weren't happy with each other's presence, and a definitive border was finally set in 1914. In 1975, Portugal decided it was done with Portuguese Timor, and a conflict broke out amongst East Timorese political parties. However, in December of that year, Indonesia invaded East Timor and declared it as its 27th province. However, the invasion did not come peacefully, and has come to be known as the East Timor Genocide, as the East Timorese resisted Indonesian rule, resulting in the deaths of around 200,000 people. The violence had continued throughout the 70s, 80s and 90s, with many massacres taking place in the capital of Dili. The Santa Cruz massacre in 1991 was seen as a rallying point for independence by the East Timorese, as Indonesian troops slaughtered 250 unarmed civilians in a graveyard in Dili, an attack widely condemned throughout the world. In 1999, the East Timorese had their independence referendum, with a question asking if the public accepted plans for East Timor to gain special autonomy but still remain part of Indonesia, similar to how Hong Kong and Macau sit with China. However, an overwhelming majority voted to reject the proposal and accept independence, but the voting didn't come without its own wave of violence, as anti-independence militants attacked civilians and violence spread throughout the country, leading to 1,400 deaths. However, East Timor had voted, and they finally gained independence in May of 2002. As you can see, Asia's newest country has a long history, and a tough one at that. But what is East Timor like today? Due to its colonial past, Portuguese is one of the two official languages of East Timor, the other being Tetum. However, Portuguese fluency is limited, and there are many different regional languages used across East Timor, with Tetum acting as the lingua franca. Indonesian and English are considered as working languages. However, there is resistance by some to learning and using both Indonesian and Portuguese, due to the negative connotations some of the population associates with the two countries. East Timor is still a fairly poor country, still suffering from the effects of its battle for independence with Indonesia, with a lot of infrastructure remaining damaged. The economy is largely dependent on exporting commodities, mainly oil, gas and coffee, with the International Monetary Fund labelling East Timor as the most oil-dependent country in the world. On top of this, private sector development has been limited. However, things have improved for East Timor, with illiteracy and poverty declining, and surplus income from oil and gas has led to the Timor-Leste Petroleum Fund, which has accumulated around $16 billion and demonstrates the government's awareness to save its natural resource wealth for the future. However, East Timor still has a lot of work to do. Poverty rates sit at around 40%, and GDP per capita is amongst the lowest in the world. GDP growth was around 10% from 2007 to 2011, but has slowed more recently. To continue in its development, East Timor must look to develop its private sector, starting with the basics, such as introducing patent laws to promote innovation and entrepreneurship. Then the country will have a more stable platform from which to grow.